Good evening. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of August. Tonight, we take a special look at the rising tensions in North Asia that have been triggered by a controversial visit to Taiwan by the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Reaction from China has been swift after ordering more military drills in the Straits of Taiwan and economic sanctions on Taipei. But just how far will Beijing go? We'll put that question and others to our correspondent in Taipei and speak with defence and security experts. Welcome to a special edition of The World. I'm Beverley O Connor. Well, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was always expected to raise tensions between China and the United States as the two superpowers contest influence in the Asia-Pacific region. Now that Ms. Pelosi has left Taiwan, the island that China labels a rebel territory is left to bear the consequences. And the reaction has been swift, beginning with a series of economic sanctions. China has now suspended exports of natural sand to Taiwan and stopped imports of fruit and fish from the self-governed island. But what is more concerning is the build-up of Chinese forces around Taiwan. These are the latest pictures from the People's Liberation Army, showing the military is already preparing to conduct manoeuvres in the waters and skies near Taiwan. There are also plans for live firing drills beginning tomorrow across multiple locations in waters surrounding the island, a move that could result in an air and sea blockade. As the sabre rattling intensifies, China's foreign ministry has accused Washington of violating China's sovereignty.
What Pelosi has done is by no means a defence or protection of democracy, but a provocation and violation of China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As many people have sharply pointed out, Pelosi's dangerous provocation purely aims to create personal political gain. This is completely an ugly farce. The US and the separatist forces for Taiwan independence should be responsible for all consequences arising from this. We will put our words into actions. As for the specific countermeasures that you asked about, what I can tell you is that what should come will come. The US and the Taiwan independence forces will feel them persistently.
Well, earlier in Taipei, Nancy Pelosi expressed her support for the island's government and for standing up to autocracy during her address to Taiwan's parliament.
We have to show the world, and that's one of the purposes of our trip, to show the world the success of the people of Taiwan, their courage to change their own country to become more democratic, their respect for people and the rest, and quite frankly, a model in this region in those respects. So strength, goodwill, and again, the demonstration of a democracy that has evolved to a stronger place now, and it offers a very strong contrast to what's happening on mainland China. No more evidence needed than what happened in Hong Kong under one country, two systems. It didn't happen.
I welcome Speaker Pelosi and the delegation to Taiwan. Thank you for taking concrete actions to show your staunch support for Taiwan at this critical moment and for expressing the US's consistent policy supporting Taiwan's self-defense.
Well, Nancy Pelosi has now left for her next leg of her Asia trip, but the tension caused by her visit is far from over. We spoke to East Asia correspondent Bill Birtles about the fallout from this short but controversial visit.
With Nancy Pelosi continuing her Asia trip, in some ways, Bev, you might think that this would bring down the extreme levels of tension between the world's two superpowers. There's a bit of an off-ramp. China obviously furious about this visit, did everything it could to stop it happening, failed to do that, but seriously wants to inflict some sort of diplomatic pain on the United States still as punishment. But with Nancy Pelosi out of here, then at least there is a reason for that Chinese anger to be dialed down a bit. But it's the Taiwanese, Bev, who have to deal with the consequences more than Nancy Pelosi. And late today, you had the Chinese Customs Agency adding yet more fruit and food products to this new banned exports list. That's the economic hit. That's the pressure that China is trying to apply. And then for the military, of course, in the coming days, probably already on the seas as of this evening, there's a real test to see whether China will make good on that threat of carrying out live fire exercises and military drills in pockets of the sea that encroach on Taiwan's territorial waters.
And this is where things could get very tense and Taiwan could be left to pick up the pieces of her visit.
Yeah, and we're talking about tonight, the next few days. It's really immediate, the risk of some sort of confrontation between the Chinese forces and the Taiwanese forces. I was speaking to a defence analyst here in Taiwan today, one who I've spoken to before, and he seems to be fairly sceptical of all the Chinese sabre rattling whenever I talk to him. He said something interesting. He said that the Chinese are well aware of Taiwan's bottom lines when it comes to their territory, and he doesn't believe that the PLA will actually send ships and aircraft to those parts of the designated no-go zones which overlap with Taiwan's territory. He thinks even they know that that's a step too far. But in the next couple of days, we will find out, Bev, and what the Taiwanese Defence Forces said today is that it will resolutely defend Taiwan's sovereignty. So this really does raise a possibility of some sort of clash on the high seas.
Yeah. Bill, give us a sense of how people on the ground actually felt about this visit. It seems as if not everyone was thrilled that Nancy Pelosi turned up.
Well, the protests against the visit were pretty small, and looking at Taiwanese news channels, for the past few nights they've all been running rolling coverage on this, as you'd expect. Seems to me that most people were generally supportive of this trip because, at the very least, there has been an increase in anxiety here because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, not everybody. There are a lot of Taiwanese who are surprisingly relaxed about this prospect of future conflict. They're so used to hearing Chinese rhetoric and sabre-rattling that they don't really think the Chinese will use force. But then there are others who have changed their minds in recent months and have seen what's happened in Ukraine and are increasingly anxious. So I think in general, there was a feeling that Taiwan does need US reassurance, and having Nancy Pelosi here, even though it's led to some very serious blowback from Beijing, at least it looks for now symbolically like a pretty strong sign of American reassurance.
And China, of course, you know well, Bill. Do you feel that most of this bluster and rhetoric is for the domestic audience?
Yeah, so a lot of people say that. A lot of analysts and experts, they say, look, Xi Jinping, he's under pressure at the moment. He can't look weak. He has this a power grab in a few months where he's trying to retain his rule of the country. He's very likely to do it. But he nonetheless is doing a lot of internal shuffling and horse trading and all that sort of stuff behind closed doors. It is not a good time for him to look weak. Also, too, China's economy is in a bad way at the moment. The COVID-0 policies are causing a bit of resentment. So some people are saying, look, this is a very good opportunity for Xi Jinping to look tough, to look strong, and to divert domestic Chinese attention towards other issues, Taiwan. But looking at the videos that were going around in social media of tanks being moved, of missiles being moved in eastern cities, looking at the state media rhetoric, looking at the commentary and the violence that some of the more extreme state media commentators advocated, it does feel to me, Bev, that little by little, year by year, Xi Jinping is normalising the idea publicly in China that there one day will have to be a conflict over Taiwan, and it is very much the narrative that it will be a defensive conflict, that China will be defending this part of China, Taiwan in China's eyes, from some sort of agitation by the Americans. This seems to be a pretty consistent rhetorical theme. And the last few days, the commentary I saw online in China, it just seemed to hit new heights compared to what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, perhaps played into that narrative perfectly as well. Good to talk, Bill. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bev.
Well, the events of the past few hours have also sparked concerns globally. Here in Australia, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said the level of American engagement with Taipei is a matter for the United States, but he's also reiterated Canberra's position on Taiwan.
We live in an era where there's strategic competition and increased tension in our region, and where China has taken a more aggressive posture in the region. But our position on Taiwan is clear. We don't want to see any unilateral change to the status quo, and we'll continue to work with partners to promote peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
Meantime, Russia's foreign minister says the visit to Taiwan by Ms Pelosi was a deliberate attempt by Washington to inflame China.
I dare not judge what drove them, but I have no doubt that this reflects the same line we have been talking about regarding the Ukrainian situation. It is a desire to prove to everyone their impunity and to exercise permissiveness. I do what I want, something like that. I see no other reason to create such an annoyance almost out of the blue, knowing very well what it means for the People's Republic of China.
And residents in Beijing have been following developments closely with varied views on how their government should respond.
We have tolerated for too long. We should act whenever needed. Chairman Mao once said political power comes out of the barrel of a gun. I was born in the 1960s and I know Chairman Mao's strategy is correct. Now the country is powerful and the economy is strong. We should no longer tolerate American imperialism.
The United States time and time again interfere in our domestic affairs. Our people are very dissatisfied with this. The US keeps meddling in the business of others. I hope that no one interferes in our national reunification. We will take care of our own business.
Both China and the United States want to avoid going into war. This is for sure because China and the US need each other in trade and other aspects. I think we must exert pressure in response to Pelosi's Taiwan visit, but don't fight.
Well, as we heard earlier, Beijing announced it would carry out targeted military operations in the surrounding waters and skies over coming days, including live fire military drills. Shashank Joshi is defence editor at The Economist. He joins us live out of London. Shashank, rather tense times at the moment. What do you think we're going to see in coming days from China?
I think we're going to see a very deliberate and considered effort, a campaign to punish Taiwan for welcoming Pelosi, to signal its isolation from its international partners, and to demonstrate how much has changed since the 30 years have passed since we last had, or 25 years have passed since we last had a crisis of this magnitude. And the military exercises that you have just discussed, which are noticeably closer to Taiwan than those that were conducted in 1995 and 1996 in what we call the third Taiwan Straits crisis, I think those are going to be the first step in a process of coercion of Taiwan. I think we'll also probably see some kind of economic pressure on Taiwan, comparable perhaps to that which China applied to Japan 12 years ago over a crisis in the East China Sea, when we saw a Chinese embargo on rare earth materials at the time. So we could see similar kinds of targeted economic pressure. And I think overall, we are entering into a much more dangerous period. There are also suggestions China could attack or seize an outlying Taiwanese island. I think those kinds of scenarios are considerably less likely. I think that China is more interested in signaling and in punishing than it is in actually initiating any kind of conflict. But we are entering into a much, much more dangerous period, I think. And
Shashank, with that danger, is there a risk of a confrontation that could be more than just a misstep?
There are always these risks when you have large forces in proximity and when Taiwan is concerned, where the stakes are very high, where US commitments are ambiguous, and both US and Chinese credibility is on the line. what I would say is, looking at these military exercises, this isn't just a show of force. This will also have political and economic consequences for Taiwan. So some of these activities, artillery firing, missile firing, naval drills, some of these are within 10 miles of Taiwan's coastline, much closer than previous drills. And if this begins to significantly disrupt air activity and maritime activity, civilian shipping, merchant shipping, civilian air traffic, we will begin to blur the boundaries between muscle flexing and a blockade or an embargo. And of course, blockades and embargoes, as we know from our experience in the Cuban Missile Crisis, our experience of Odessa in the Black Sea more recently, are very, very serious things, and they have the potential for great tension and confrontation in them.
How long would it take for that kind of blockade to impact Taiwan in terms of trade?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'll be completely honest. As a defense analyst, I don't have a good answer to that because I don't know enough about the pattern of merchant shipping, civilian traffic in and out of Taiwan. But look, one of the wonderful things about modern technology is that you can all log on to a site like marinetraffic.com. You can see for yourself the sheer volume of shipping that throngs around Taiwan's ports every day. This is a huge economy, a very sophisticated economy that makes the best semiconductors in the world, has very high-tech industries on the island. You can see how busy Taiwanese ports are, how busy the Taiwan Straits are, how tightly integrated Taiwan is to other markets in Asia, including Australia and others across the world. And those ships are constant. So I think one thing I will be watching in the days ahead over the course of these activities, which I believe is scheduled to run for about 4 or 5 days, although I would double check that, that how much that chokes off this activity. I don't think China is going to seriously blockade Taiwan, for months and months. But I think what we are going to see is a possible signal, a hint as to what it is capable of doing. And that is going to put US, Japanese, Korean, Australian, other Asian credibility on the line, because it puts the onus of escalation onto other states. China is saying, we can do this around Taiwan, and if you want to stop us, you have to come and stop us and do it, which puts the onus of escalation onto you.
Yes, which changes the stakes really dramatically in the region. We heard Sergei Lavrov sort of compare it to Russia's justification for the invasion of Ukraine. Is it concerning, you talk about coercion, perhaps in both economic and pressured ways for Taiwan, but is it concerning that China could look for a defensive argument to move on Taiwan in coming years and months even?
I think that in the past several years, the United States, and indeed in some ways all of us, have been very lucky to have a Taiwanese leadership that is very cautious. It is very careful about not pushing Chinese buttons. For example, anything that might be interpreted as a drive towards formal independence. And that has always been perceived to be the most significant of all the Chinese red lines. Not the only one. There are other provocations. The last major Taiwan Straits crisis was precipitated by a visit, not to Taiwan, but a visit of the Taiwanese leadership to the United States. So there are many things that can cause a crisis. But we've been lucky to have a leadership that has not pushed for independence, that has not pushed that particular button in provocative, dangerous ways. And that has resulted in breathing room for the United States to supply Taiwan with assistance, and indeed for other countries to intensify their support to Taiwan, often covertly, often very quietly and discreetly. And I would put Australia in that camp, by the way. What happens if China is able to point to these things as evidence that the US and others are changing the status quo on Taiwan, which is not true. It isn't true, but that's how China is seeking to portray it, is that it may not just justify Chinese activity, but by China talking this up, create a nationalist fervor within China that puts pressure on the leadership at a reasonably sensitive time in the way that you've been describing on your show, with the Party Congress coming up, Xi Jinping in a politically delicate moment. And of course, that is the time in which leaders sometimes feel compelled to take more risks, than they otherwise would do.
Shashank, always appreciate you putting this in perspective for us. Thanks so much. Well, with the world keeping a close eye on the deteriorating security situation between China and Taiwan, leaders back home are determined not to be caught out. The federal government has announced a sweeping review of the nation's military, with one of the men set to oversee it issuing a stark warning. Here's Defence Correspondent Andrew Green.
Defence's old guard ushered in to confront new challenges.
Angus, I'm very much looking forward to working with you closely again.
A former Defence Minister and the chief who served under him appointed to conduct a comprehensive review of the military they once led.
It's absolutely imperative that we review the current strategic circumstances, which I rate the worst I've ever seen in my career.
The dire regional outlook highlighted by growing tensions across the Taiwan Strait. The Prime Minister calling for calm.
Our position on Taiwan is clear. We don't want to see any unilateral change to the status quo, and we'll continue to work with partners to promote peace and stability.
With the government concerned by the risk of state-on-state conflict, it wants to ensure Australia is prepared.
This will be the most significant review that we have seen of our Defence Force in decades.
This latest review has the backing of the military community, but not all are happy with the former Labor minister who's helping draft it.
Why they go for Stephen Smith, who is basically generally rated as among the worst 5 defence ministers of the last 70-odd years, is just a complete and utter puzzle.
Stephen Smith oversaw the biggest cuts to defence spending since the Second World War, so we'll be watching it very closely.
The strategic review will closely examine billions of dollars in military projects, many which are running late and over budget. It will recommend some be cut and others expanded, which could dramatically reshape the look of the Australian Defence Force. Cabinet will consider the findings in March next year, just as a decision is unveiled on the long-awaited option for Australia's nuclear-powered AUKUS submarines. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, videos of military movements in China that would usually be censored are circulating on Weibo, which of course is China's largest social media platform. ABC bilingual reporter Bang Xiao has been monitoring those social media posts, and he's with us now. Bang, great to have you with us. Tell us what you've been seeing.
So from yesterday in the morning, we've seen a huge spike in traffic on Chinese social media Weibo, where lots of netizens were posting video content about China's military activities in the southern city of Xiamen, which is actually just across the Taiwan Strait.
So very close.
Yep. So basically, those video contents were being shared on Weibo and some closed or private chat room on WeChat, where Chinese people discuss about what has been going on. Apparently, the censorship started a while Nancy Pelosi arrived in Taiwan, and the most censored content was actually the image of a welcoming message displayed by the LED lights on the tallest building in Taipei, which is dubbed Taipei 101.
That's really interesting. So these images, are they normally censored by China? Do you think in this instance they wanted people to understand that they were taking action?
Well, this is a really, really interesting question because normally any, activities related to the Chinese government officials or the military activities would be censored. But the interesting point of yesterday's internet trend is that those contents have been circulating on multiple platforms for a long time, and it's still existing and being shared and commented by netizens right now. So obviously, when Chinese social media is believed to be a heavily censored platform for netizens to use the internet, those contents which is not being censored could be delivering a message that the government would intentionally want the Chinese people domestically to understand.
To see it, that's interesting. China has very quickly slapped some trade sanctions on Taiwan. Does that not feel counterintuitive to you, given it's meant to be one China? That's what they keep pushing.
This is a really good question. So one thing that is always so fascinating is that, while Beijing is actually sending a very strong narrative against Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's, speech today along with Pelosi, but the problem is that in the narrative, there is kind of a loophole. While China is claiming Taiwan is part of its sovereignty, at the same time, China is actually using economic coercion and sanctions against a province which it claims
as its own. Yes.
As its own. So a lot of people were asking the question, like, how China could sanction itself if Taiwan is part of China?
Yes, very interesting. How are Taiwanese people feeling? I mean, did they welcome this visit? I mean, the sort of attention that it's garnered them, was it worth it? What have they been saying and feeling?
There is definitely mixed feeling from Taiwanese people, according to our interviews with a lot of residents in Taiwan. Many of them, they welcomed Pelosi's visit because they feel like, this is going to give Taiwan a better exposure on a global stage. Because Taiwan is banned from joining a lot of international organizations, for example, the WHO, or joining the Olympic Games as Taiwan or the Republic of China due to the so-called one China policy being imposed or acknowledged by a lot of countries, including the United Nations. So in these kind of circumstances, Taiwanese people, they do believe Pelosi's visits would bring Taiwan a better, media exposure around the world. But at the same time, it is very interesting that they don't really feel as engaged as these political current affair like, the other audiences around the world, because China's threats and China's responses, including the military threats against Taiwan, has been going on for decades. It's part of their Euro life, and they feel they get used to it very well.
Yes, and that's interesting. What is your historical perspective on how sort of dramatic this is? Is this the worst that you've noticed it?
So at this moment, we can't really tell if this is the worstest, but from my perspective, I think there were a couple of, crises which is that Taiwan Strait crisis was very serious in the past, including the one happened in early or mid 1990s. So in 1995 to 1996, for over 8 months, China has been using, shooting missiles, over 20 missiles, over the Taiwan Strait to target Taiwan, because at that moment, Taiwanese people elected their first president through a democratic system. And the president, Lee Teng-hui, actually visited the United States, which actually offended Beijing and caused the crisis itself.
Interesting perspective. Great to have you with us. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Well, various pro-Beijing groups have protested outside the US consulate in Hong Kong, condemning Nancy Pelosi's visit. Demonstrators threw eggs on the speaker's photo and tore up American flags as they shouted anti-US and anti-Pelosi slogans.
Our country and the US have signed the One China policy. Although she said it's a personal visit, everyone knows she's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. She represents the country to destroy the One China principle, supporting Taiwan independence.
Well, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan came at a time of deteriorating relations between the US and China. Founder and editor of EA Worldview, Scott Lucas, joins us out of Birmingham. Scott, always good to have you on at moments like this in history. This is the first time in well over 20 years that such a senior US official has chosen to visit Taiwan. Why now?
Well, there's a personal dimension and then a wider dimension. I think the personal dimension is that Nancy Pelosi, her constituency in California, has a lot of Chinese Americans. She's been interested in Chinese issues, Taiwan issues, for decades and has spoken out vocally on it. And remember that Pelosi is part of a congressional delegation. There are other representatives there, and they're visiting not only Taiwan, they're visiting Asia. So this is in the wider context of U.S. relations with Asia, which brings us to the wider context of a realignment of the Biden administration's policy. You might remember in 2021, there were loud noises from both sides. We were looking at confrontation. The Biden folks were kind of moving around as to how much they wanted to challenge China. Now we're sort of getting the lines being drawn. We had the nuclear deal, nuclear subs deal with Australia and the UK. We've got the bolstering of the Quad with India, with Japan, with South Korea. We've got other U.S. economic initiatives. And this visit, although it is not official in terms of representing the administration, is sort of America saying to China, look, we know we'll be competing with you economically, we'll compete with you politically. We know you have a one China policy, but no need to overrun Taiwan. No military threats against Taiwan, because of course earlier this year, China was putting the overflights over Taiwan. They're making provocative noises about a non-political way to bring about one China. And this is the U.S. in fact saying, no, that you're not going to do that.
How does Taiwan get any form of assurance over this visit?
Well, there's a wider framework, which is the U.S. has given Taiwan an assurance since the 1950s that it would defend Taiwan against Chinese military attack. Now, that's wavered from time to time. The political position changed when formally the U.S. recognized Beijing rather than Taiwan in the 1970s. But the reassurance here is, look, Taiwan's economy, Taiwan's people, Taiwan's not sovereignty, we can't say sovereignty, but Taiwan's security, they've got someone behind them. And Bev, let me put this in a wider context. I want to throw something to you that other people may not have watched. There's been another visit in the last few days that no one really noticed. The Taiwan parliament speaker and a delegation went to Lithuania, a country far away in the Baltics. Now, why is that important? A few months ago, Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open up an economic interest office, the first one in Europe. China was upset about this. Beijing said it violated independence. Guess what? Lithuania not only still has that office, it's opening its own economic office in Taiwan. Not just the U.S., but other countries are saying, look, beyond the veneer of the one China policy, where is the space for Taiwan economically, and not always having to look to Beijing to give a yes or no on what that answer might be.
And that is a really great point that you make, because I was going to say to you, look, so many countries have now acknowledged the inevitable that China wants recognition of the one China policy. Do you start seeing this now as a sort of watering down of that sort of global commitment to that?
I think it's a reconsideration of it. And I think there's a couple of factors that come into play here. One thing that hasn't been mentioned recently, as far as I can tell, is Hong Kong. And of course, Hong Kong, part of a one China policy when China regained sovereignty over it. But the crackdown in Hong Kong unsettled a lot of people, not just because of human rights, but economically as well. What would happen next? So the idea that China would repeat that with Taiwan, and that they would do that by breaking the timetable, in other words, by doing it sooner rather than later, I think means that countries are reassessing what they do. Now, few have gone as far as Lithuania. Notably, the European Union ran way far away from that.
Yeah.
But still, I think in Asia, you're looking for allies, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, some of whom Pelosi visited before going to Taiwan, who are effectively saying, we don't want a China-U.S. confrontation, but we want to know where the lines are here. And I think the lines are being drawn in the hope that neither Beijing nor Washington crosses them in the near future.
So that is fascinating. Do you think in that way it could take the temperature out of any attempt by Beijing to view this as a sort of excuse to defensively try and take Taiwan?
I think this may actually be a pressure cooker moment in the sense of releasing the pressure. Now, that might sound strange where the headlines are, but let me say that for two reasons. First of all, go back to the 1950s. We've had times where publicly the U.S. and China have been close to war, even close to nuclear war. When that happened, and here's my second point, it's the private conversations that mattered. The reason why they didn't go to war in the 50s is there were private communications between Washington and Beijing for everyone to step back. After Tiananmen Square in 1989, with the anger at the Chinese repression of the democracy movement in that country, there were private communications about avoiding a wider confrontation, where this goes. And so a few days ago, President Joe Biden spoke to Xi Jinping on the phone in a private conversation, very little was said publicly, where I suspect lines were drawn. China will protest this visit. They'll have their military exercises that you've been hearing about, but they will not go in to overturn Taiwan's status. The U.S. will support Taiwan's current status without supporting Taiwanese independence. And then it's a live and let live situation.
You talk of that private conversation after which we saw a lot of bluster from China. Do you feel there was a different acknowledgement, a different agreement behind the scenes? And does that mean there still needs to be quite a recalibration in the relations between the two?
Well, this has to be an ongoing process. I mean, the opening months of the Biden administration was just a disaster on U.S.-China relations with that public showdown in Alaska, of all places, where they effectively were shouting at each other. What the U.S. has done since then is rather than go directly against China, has been talk to Australia, talk to the Japanese, talk to the South Koreans, talk to Asia. China is talking to its own potential partners with the Belt and Road Initiative. What you have to hope is both countries are realigning on the prospect of competition. Because here's why, Bev, I don't really buy the idea of a military confrontation over Taiwan. If China goes after Taiwan, they risk international isolation in many quarters, and second, they undermine their own economic approaches. Taiwan's important to China economically as it is, but it is also part of a wider Asian approach by the Chinese for economic expansion, and war is not good for business in the long run.
Yeah, really good perspective, and one that Ukraine has, I guess, sharply brought into focus. Great, as always, Scott, to talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bev.
And that is where we'll end our special coverage of the growing tensions in North Asia, of course, triggered by Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.